Hey, I'm Zack Semke, Director of Passive House Accelerator, and I'm super excited to share putting the punk into Passive House with you. So welcome to part 2. In part 1, I shared what the science is telling us about the climate crisis. I pushed back on doomerist narratives that say it's too late. And I introduced my kids and how I want to teach them strength and resilience so that they can thrive. I promised to share some stories about why I think we can thrive, even in the face of the climate crisis. So that's where I'm going to start here. The first story is the story of the power of arithmetic, and it starts with the origins of chess. As the story goes, chess was invented in ancient India by a man named Sisa under the reign of King Shriram. The king loved chess, and he played it all the time. So he summoned Sisa to his palace and said, "Sisa, I'm so pleased with you for creating chess. I'd like to give you a reward. What would you like?" Now, Sisa thought this over and responded, "I'm a simple man. How about you give me rice? But can we use the chessboard to determine how much rice? Let's put 1 grain of rice on the first square, 2 on the second, 4 on the next, then 8, then 16, and so on. How does that sound?" Now, the king laughed at the modesty of Sisa's proposal, and he said, "Of course," and he summoned his calculators to come figure out the math. Now, you see where this is going. We've got exponential growth happening here. So let's just pause for a moment and take a guess at how many grains of rice will be called for on that last 64th square up at the top right. So remember that number. We'll come back to your guess in a bit. Okay, so by the end of the first row of the chessboard, the calculators calculated that 128 grains of rice belonged on that last square, plus n minus 1 for the previous squares, or 127 grains, so a total of 255 grains on that first row. And that n plus n minus 1 relationship holds true for the rest of the board. By the end of the second row, we get to 32,768 grains of rice. Then 8 million by the end of the third row, and 2 billion by the end of the fourth row, plus roughly 2 billion grains of rice on all of the preceding squares, for a total of about 4 billion grains of rice on the first half of the chessboard. Now, at this point, the king's calculators started to get a bit spooked because they saw where this was headed and they were worried about how the king would react. But they had a job to do, so they kept at it. By the end of the fifth row, they were at 549 billion grains of rice, then 140 trillion, then 36 quadrillion, and finally 9 quintillion grains of rice on that last 64th square, plus roughly 9 quintillion grains on the rest of the board, for a total of over 18 quintillion grains of rice, or roughly 1,000 times global rice production in 2010. If you were to pile all that rice into a big mound, it would be as tall as Mount Everest. Now, this story has 2 endings. The first is that the king is so impressed by Sisa's understanding of exponential growth that he has him appointed his right-hand man. The second is that he is so disgusted by his insolence that he has him executed. But in either case, the story has 2 morals. The first is the incredible power of exponential growth. The second is how non-intuitive that power is, how difficult it is for us to grok it. While I'm sure you had a big number in your head when you guessed how many grains of rice belonged on that 64th square, I bet you did not guess 9 quintillion. That would have seemed extreme. Which brings me to our next story, the story of Mediocristan versus Extremistan. Nicholas Nassim Taleb writes about the non-intuitive nature of nonlinear change in his book, The Black Swan. He proposes that natural and social phenomena, including processes of growth, can be divided into 2 provinces, the province of Mediocristan and the province of Extremistan. Neither is better or worse than the other, they're just governed by fundamentally different rules. We're most familiar with the province of Mediocristan because that is where our daily experience belongs. Human height, for example, lives in Mediocristan. It's characterized by gradual and linear growth. It's predictable. It's fairly egalitarian, with no big winners or big losers. You don't see a 20-foot tall person walking around. Everyone gets a fairly equal slice of the human height pie. Human height is also easy to understand with a very small sample size. An alien could swoop down to Earth, randomly sample the height of 5 adult humans, and get a really good picture of what human height is all about. In Mediocristan, there are no big surprises. Things are intuitive and governed by common sense. Mediocristan is mild. Extremistan, on the other hand, is wild. Two talented musicians, Bono and a busker, for example, might make ridiculously divergent sums of money. Bono's take-home pay pre-COVID was $108 million per year, whereas the street musician, if he was lucky, made $40,000 a year. Extremistan is not egalitarian. It's a realm of big winners and big losers, a few giants among a sea of dwarves. Even the salary of a symphony violinist, say $120,000, pales in comparison to Bono's income. Here, I've made a chart for you. It wasn't always this way for musicians, as Taleb notes. Back when musicians were governed by the rules of Mediocristan, even the most famous opera singer had to sing in front of a live audience every night to earn her keep. Her work was not scalable because space and time held her back. That all changed with the advent of recording technology and the gramophone. Suddenly, that same opera singer could step in front of a microphone, sing a 5-minute aria, and that aria could be cut onto a record, duplicated thousands or even millions of times, and sold around the world. Through technology, the singer's 5 minutes of work could be leveraged for exponential return. Her work became scalable, and musicians entered the realm of Extremistan. Extremistan is also non-intuitive and deeply unpredictable. When Bono was 15 years old, nobody would have guessed that he would be earning $108 million per year in late middle age singing for U2. Extremistan also has relevance to climate change. In the past 800,000 years, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere has never exceeded 300 parts per million. Never, that is, until a few decades ago when it blew past 300 parts per million, then past 350, then 400, and now exceeds 420 parts per million. This spike in greenhouse gas concentrations belongs in Extremistan. What makes climate change scary is that it's full of vicious cycles, positive feedback loops with very negative consequences. For example, the waning albedo effect. As ice melts, the Earth becomes less reflective, so it warms more, and more ice melts, and that starts feeding off itself. Or methane in permafrost. As the Earth warms, permafrost melts, methane is released, and the Earth warms more. Or as polar ice melts, meltwater pools at the poles, which triggers a process by which ice sheets break up faster, which means more ice melts, and that feeds on itself. Because of these kinds of vicious cycles, we're approaching a number of potential tipping points in the Amazon, the Arctic, Atlantic circulation, coral reefs, and more. So nonlinear change on the climate crisis side has considerable destructive power. But we also have nonlinear change to harness on the climate solution side, which brings me to our next story, 1001 Days in the Life of a Turkey. On day 1, the turkey has clean water to drink, good food to eat, and a free range to range around. He's gradually getting plumper and stronger. I mean, there are ups and downs for the turkey, but generally life is good. Every day the turkey wakes up and basically knows what's coming. He figures he understands the boundary conditions of his life. And that's confirmed for him with each day that passes. What could go wrong? He's living the good life in Mediocristan. The problem is that for the turkey, Thanksgiving belongs in Extremistan. So when day 1001 rolls around, the axe comes down, the feathers are plucked, and the turkey is served for Thanksgiving dinner. And it's that event, an event that the turkey could not or would not see coming. Maybe he didn't notice his friends disappearing every 365 days. That is the Black Swan event. You had an established system, the turkey's life, that is completely upended, in this case, ended, by this unforeseen event that no one saw coming. At least no turkeys did. And what Nassim Nicholas Taleb argues is that many of the turning points in human history can be described using this graph. The fall of the Berlin Wall, 9/11, the election of the first black president, marriage equality, the election of Donald Trump, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the resistance to it by Zelensky and the Ukrainian people, as well as the international response. A black swan event can be positive or negative, but in all cases, you've got an established system that the experts figure they understand, that is then completely disrupted by an event that no one saw coming. And this looks a lot like a black swan. This graph was published in 2014 by AllianceBernstein, the asset management firm that manages $697 billion in assets the last time I checked. Your retirement account may be managed by AllianceBernstein. Anyway, these are sober folks. Yet they title this graph, welcome to the Terror Dome because they know something big is afoot here. What we're looking at is the price of energy in emerging Asian markets, though the same basic graph applies across the world now. At the bottom of the graph, we see the wavering lines of the status quo, the cost of energy provided by fossil fuels, coal, oil, and liquefied natural gas. Then, out of nowhere, comes solar energy crashing down from out of the sky, quite literally. Before 2007, solar energy was so expensive that it didn't even register on this graph. But by 2013, it has crashed down to challenge fossil fuels on price without subsidy. And the authors of the AllianceBernstein study say that they expect solar energy to continue to fall in price because solar energy is a technology, not a fuel. And in technology, innovation drives costs down. You've probably heard of Moore's Law, which says that every couple of years, the number of transistors that fit on a chip will double, which explains the exponential increase in computing power and the equally fast drop in the cost of that power. Well, in the solar energy space, we have a similar law. It's called Swanson's Law, or Wright's Law, or simply learning by doing. And what it says is that every time we double the number of solar panels that are deployed around the world, the price of those panels comes down by 20% due to all of the learning that happens to make that deployment happen. As you can see, since 1976, the price per watt of solar PV declined from about $100 to less than 25 cents. This is a big deal. This learning by doing applies to other technologies as well. Here we see a drop in price per doubling of deployment, also known as the learning rate, of 36% for solar PV over the past 10 years. For onshore wind, the learning rate is 23%. Offshore wind, 10%. Nuclear energy has actually increased in cost, so we're not seeing a learning rate there. And coal is not a technology, but a fuel, so there's no learning rate there either. The plummeting cost of solar energy makes deployment cheaper and more attractive, so we're seeing exponential growth in solar energy deployment and generation around the world. And as we deploy more, the cost of solar gets even cheaper, so we deploy yet more. So we've got a beautiful virtuous circle going on here with nonlinear change in the climate solution space. Yet the experts cannot or will not grok it. This graph compares actual year-on-year growth of solar capacity with forecast after forecast made by the world's leading experts on energy, its most respected energy prognosticators, the International Energy Agency, or IEA. As you can see, there's a total mismatch between their predictions and the real world. For example, in 2010, the black line shows that 20 gigawatts of solar capacity was installed that year. The IEA saw that deployment and said, wow, that's a big number, but we don't expect an increase in growth next year. In fact, solar deployment will be flat or even decline moving forward. Then in 2011, global deployment increased to over 30 gigawatts of solar capacity. Again, IEA said, wow, that's a big number, but we don't expect an increase in growth next year. In fact, solar deployment will be flat or even decline moving forward. And this continued year after year. In 2020, IEA actually finally projected some significant growth, but it was still decades behind actual growth. Now, all of this would be comical if it weren't for the fact that fossil fuel companies can use these IEA projections as a justification for continuing to increase operations. And governments can be misled to believe that renewable energy will always be a minor player in solution making. Now, in some ways, it isn't IEA's fault. This is the nature of a black swan event. IEA is accustomed to energy as a fuel, which belongs in Mediocristan, but energy as a technology belongs in Extremistan. Let's dig in a bit deeper. This graph from energy expert and futurist Ramez Naam shows that solar costs have dropped by a factor of 5 since 2010. Utility scale solar is now cheaper than all but a tiny sliver of fossil electricity, and this is way ahead of forecasts. In 2010, the IEA predicted that solar would cost 22 cents per kilowatt hour by 2020. The more optimistic Ramez Naam predicted that it would be 13 cents per kilowatt hour by 2020. But actually, it cost just 5 cents. And if you project those forecasts forward, you can see that solar costs are literally decades ahead of forecasts. Ramez Naam is showing here that the learning rate of utility-scale solar power has averaged somewhere between 30 to 40% in recent decades, which is consistent with that 36% figure I shared a few slides back. He goes on to show that if we apply the more conservative end of that range, a 30% learning rate, and assume a very conservative 16% compound annual growth rate for the solar industry, that 2050 costs should drop to below 1 cent per kilowatt hour in all but the highest cost locations. As you can see, this is well below that gray region that shows the operating cost range of already built fossil power plants. Still, IEA's 2019 projections remain out of touch with this dynamic, with a curve that is decades behind. Now, none of this comes as a surprise to technologists because they are familiar with the S-curve of technology adoption, which starts with a period of exponential growth that then levels off as a successful technology approaches 100% market share. This S-curve has held true for decades for all sorts of successful technologies, starting with electricity, the telephone, refrigerators, TVs, computers, the internet, cell phones, and the curves are getting steeper today. Now, it's hard not to note the mirror image between the S-curve of technology adoption and the downward curve of emissions that is necessary to halt climate change. It seems like this relationship could come in handy soon. And in fact, it is. Despite how maddeningly slow climate policy progress has been, despite 4 years of a pro-coal US president, and despite delay tactics by the fossil fuel industry, wind and solar deployment are currently on track for the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. Now, all of the usual caveats apply, of course. Wind and solar are just a portion of the climate solutions that we need to put into place to achieve our climate goals. And just because they're on track now doesn't mean that this will necessarily continue apace. But what Ember is showing in the report is that if wind and solar continue the 20% year-on-year growth of the past 10 years for the next 10 years, that the exponential curve of deployment that this generates will be consistent with the growth that IEA says is necessary for a 1.5 degree pathway. I love this homemade Twitter infographic created by energy analyst Simon Evans based on the Ember report. In 2011, wind and solar were responsible for just 2% of global electricity generation. By 2016, that number had grown to 5%, and by 2021, 10%. If this doubling continues, then it's time to think back to the chess story to consider the implications. And investment in clean energy shows no signs of slowing, with a huge increase in investment for electrified transport. See the green bars there. And passive house is growing exponentially too. This data from FIAS shows that both the number of FIAS units and FIAS square footage is more than doubling every 2 years. Total square footage is approaching 30 million square feet in North America. That figure still pales in comparison to overall construction, but don't discount the power of exponential growth. And policies in places like New York, Massachusetts, British Columbia, Toronto, and elsewhere promise to propel this growth. So, given all of this, where are we headed with warming? We heard from the doomists before, so we know what they think. But what about the experts that are watching the clean energy transition unfold? What is today's business as usual projection? To find out, please check out part 3 of Putting the Punk into Passive House. And to learn more about Passive House, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, visit PassiveHouseAccelerator.com, and join in at our Passive House Accelerator Live Zoom events on Wednesdays. Thanks for watching.